Hi there. So a little bit about the way that our session is going to go is we're going to tell a little bit about my story and sort of how I wound up in the complaint process, and then how our relationship developed over time to now. So I filed a complaint. I was a student who went on service trips. Service is something that has always been very big in my life, and I think mostly because of participation in the Methodist Church and that belief in service. I went to a service trip called the June Project for several years throughout my time growing up. My first time I went was the summer between 8th and ninth grade. There I met the pastor who ran that trip. And over the course of several years, I got to know him very well. I started to have a lot of challenges during my time in high school. I did not have a very supportive parental unit at all. I grew up in a single family home with a mom that was oftentimes absent. During that time, I began to have a lot of challenges and issues growing up. So I chose a lot of decisions that I don't think were very healthy for me at the time. I was kind of a mess, and it became very evident throughout my time with participation in church life to some of the clergy that were around me. This particular pastor took an interest in me, and he reached out to me and said that he had seen that I was struggling and that he was willing to help me. Over the time of my senior year in high school, I had overdosed on drugs. I had gone into rehab, and I'd started to sort of figure out who I was and where I was going with my life, sort of. And this pastor said that he had noticed the changes, and he really wanted to help me. In the time that he decided that he wanted to help me, we had met for what he called counseling. And the first time we met, it was fairly normal. After that, things started to feel a little uncomfortable. And it got to the point where in our relationship, he had said that he felt like he could share God's love for me in a way that my parents couldn't. And that through having sex with me would be the way that God was telling him to share his love. That continued for a few years. I was 18 the very first time that we had sex, and I was in college. It got to a point where I realized that it wasn't really healthy, so I ended that relationship. Still not really realizing that anything that had happened was wrong. I went to grad school for counseling. And in my ethics class, I learned that our relationship really wasn't a healthy relationship, and that something wrong had happened. For the longest time, I had thought that I had done something wrong and that I had caused this man to stray. And in that class, I realized that that's actually not really the case. And so I had reached out to him, and I had said, I realized that this shouldn't have happened. And he said, I know. I made an incredibly selfish mistake, and it will never happen again because I have left the clergy. I have retired. He was significantly older than I was. And I didn't think anything of it. I thought, okay, well, that seems good enough. And then Hurricane Sandy happened. I live in New Jersey. I had kept in touch with my youth pastor at the time, who was now his own pastor in his own church. It was not the same person. And after Sandy, this big storm that had happened, his church area had been hit really hard, and they needed help with cooking. They created this whole feeding center kind of thing. So service is something that I'm always passionate about, so I started serving. I had not gone to church in years, but I knew how to cook food, and I was fairly good at it. So I cooked breakfast on the weekends every Saturday and Sunday, and as I would go on Sundays, it would run right into the time that church would start. And so I'd started staying for church and going back to church. And several months into doing that, because the feeding center was up for almost a year, it was an area that was hit really hard, and people needed to be out of their homes for a significant amount of time. My youth pastor mentioned in church that he would be running this service trip and that he needed chaperones. And it took me a second, and he said, this is the trip that we're going on. And I knew that trip. That was the same trip that I had gone on. And so all of these bells started going off in my head, like, how is that possible? Because he retired. He told me he retired years ago. So how is that real? And so I asked my youth pastor, I said, hey, how's that real? I was like, who's running that now? Him not knowing the relationship that I'd had. And he said, well, he's coming back into ministry starting in July. And it took me a couple of months to sort of figure out, like, do I share what happened? Do I not? Like, what do I do? And so eventually I told my youth pastor, this is sort of the relationship that I had. It was really unhealthy. He told me he retired. And my youth pastor said, hey, anything that you want to do, I fully support you. And so I said, great, I think I'm going to file a complaint. And he said, great, write it up. Send it to me. I'll look it over. I'll make sure that it's everything that it should be. And so I did. And then my youth pastor called me right after I sent it, maybe 5-10 minutes later, and he said, hey, what's your end goal? And I said, I just think that he really shouldn't work with kids. I don't think that he knows how to have those boundaries. And he said, oh, great. Well, then we shouldn't go this route. Instead, how about an informal agreement that I can broker for you? To which he would agree not to work with youth if you'd agree not to file this complaint. At the time, I thought that was really helpful. I thought that he was looking out for me. I had experienced a big loss like right before that. So I found out that this pastor was coming back into ministry in about March of that year. In May, my mom had died. And this informal agreement came out about a week and a half after my mom had died. And so he framed it in this, like, I really want to help you and support you kind of way. And I thought that he did. And so I agreed with it. And then a week before that trip was supposed to happen, I found out that he was going anyway. So I texted my youth pastor and I said, you know what? He lied. He's going. He's working with kids. I'm filing my complaint. And I did that day. And thanks. And so my youth pastor actually stopped talking to me that day. He talked to me about 6 months later and said it was because I betrayed him by filing that complaint. I think that him offering the informal agreement was probably a violation of mine. In the time that after I reported, it took about a week. First, I met with the bishop and the chancellor. I always call them an attorney. I don't know the official Methodist language. And my pastor's district superintendent. And after that initial meeting, notice I didn't say I had anyone there with me. That's when they told me at that meeting that I could request to have someone present. And that's when took me a couple of days and I emailed them back and I said, actually, I would like to have someone here. And that is how I met Jana, who emailed me. Or I emailed her, actually. I emailed them, and they gave me an email, and they said, you can reach out to this person. I did not get a just resolution. Within about 2 weeks time, from the time that I had filed and met Jana to the time that it sort of ended, I got an email from the bishop that said he turned in his orders, and he's no longer part of the Methodist Church. And so there was never any just resolution. I still don't quite understand what that language means. I tell Jana that all the time. I don't really know what that means. And so in that time, things have gone well and things have not. He continued to run service trips with ministers from that area because there was never any resolution. There was never anything. So he wasn't a pastor anymore, but he still kind of told these stories about who I was in his version to everyone that was running those trips that didn't know who I was. There were several who did, but a lot who did not. I was a 50-year-old woman he met in California when he was on vacation and had a one-night stand. And so he did the right thing and turned in his orders because he felt like he had violated his relationship with God and his relationship with his wife. And so that trip continued to happen, and clergy continued to bring youth for several years until our bishop took some action last January, I think. So not this past January, the January before that, and held a large meeting that disclosed, hey, this is what happened, so you really need to stop doing this. I've asked you several times, like, now it really needs to end. And so that's sort of my story. And what we're going to talk about, I guess, is sort of how Jana and I have grown into our relationship. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of initial impressions and sort of what we were thinking about. When I was told that I would get a support person, I thought it was for the formal process. And so I actually sent Jana an email after I got the email from the bishop that said he had turned in his orders. I was like, okay, well, I guess I won't be needing you anymore. Thanks, though. I hadn't met her yet. I think we had emailed maybe once and talked. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm from New Jersey. I speak very fast. It's part of our culture. Yeah. So I did not actually think that we would have a relationship. We had emailed once, we had talked on the phone once, and then I got that email from the bishop. So I just sent it back and I said, I guess I don't need you. Thanks anyway, though. And so I didn't really know what the point in having a support person was. I thought that it was just purely logistical to go to like those meetings with me.
So when I originally heard from the bishop about a person who had filed a complaint and had been offered a support person to walk alongside her on the journey, the bishop shared a little bit about this specific complaint and asked if I would be willing to serve as the support person. I said yes to that, and remembered in my training to be a support person, we received training kind of in two different tracks. The first track was training around walking alongside in the formal process. The other side was offering care and support for the person who was on this journey. And so, as Krystal mentioned, very soon we heard that the pastor had surrendered orders. And so really the official process ended there. And yet here was a young woman who didn't get just resolution and was really struggling in terms of relationship with God, relationship with the church, and her own emotions around what had happened. And so that's when, in this particular case, I shifted over to care and support and walking alongside in terms of all of the emotions and where she was in that moment and where she would be moving from victim to survivor. And so I am happy to say that my experience being in relationship with Krystal, that has happened. I walked with her in the midst of the time when she was victim, and now I stand alongside her as survivor. And so it really has been a blessed journey, a difficult journey, but a blessed journey as well. So at this point, we don't want to spend this whole time talking to you. We would like for you to interact with each other. And so we're going to invite you now into some conversation and would encourage you to be in pairs at this point. If we have some places where maybe there are 3 people that would want to have conversation together, that will work. And so we're going to ask that you would think through together, have conversation around the question, if you were called to act as a support person, and in this case, it's for the victim or the complainant, how would you begin to offer support? Where would you start in terms of offering support? So we'll let you know when we'll call everybody back to the large group, but find another person or 2 other people to have conversation with. If you were called to act as a support person for the victim, how would you begin to offer support? Folks, I'm going to invite you back to the large group. We just wanted you to start to think together around some things you would be thinking about as you entered into a support relationship. And so just a few minutes of report back. What are some of the ideas that you came up with as you thought about what would be important in the initial part of this relationship?
First of all, being a listener.
Being a listener.
Definitely take away any kind of judgment. You're there to hear the story, to be affirming, but just overall, you're there to listen.
Yes. So critical, what has just been said, to be a listener, non-judgmental. You may hear in these initial meetings with someone, very difficult information to hear, and it's important to be very composed. I teach pastoral care in seminary, and one of the things that I say to students is, as soon as a person who has come to you sees deer in the headlight eyes looking back at them, they're going to shut down. So you don't want to shut down the person telling their story. You want to be as present as possible for them. What other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we realized immediately on was that if we're talking about a person who is a woman, that we may need to own the fact that our very gender may be an obstacle to being able to play that role, and to own that up front as part of our conversation.
Very important. Thank you.
But on the other hand, there's spouses. There's spouses that need to have support.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Do you mind repeating the answer so we have it on
Oh.
mic for the video?
The comment that spouses need that support as well. And so I would definitely say that would be something, in Sally's case this morning, one of the things that, if we had had more time, one of the things that I was going to bring up was the other people in that scenario that would need care. And it might not be as formalized a relationship, but I think of Sally's husband, who he is the complainant in this case. So he would be offered a support person as well as Sally. And then Wanda, imagine being the person who spoke that truth and then sees how everything unfolds and the emotions she's going to experience. And then each of the 3 people in the covenant group, along with John. And what they might be feeling. So all of those people would, and Sally's young children. That's right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question in regards to this. Just because someone may be assigned as an advocate doesn't necessarily mean that that would be considered a safe relationship or a safe space for whatever reason. So what's the procedural next step?
Well, so let's have Krystal speak to that.
So I think that you're right that that can very much feel like a not safe space. I can tell you I did not necessarily feel safe with Jana.
What did you think I was?
So I thought she was a representative of the church, and I would tell her that on a pretty regular basis. I did not think.
No, wait a minute. Wait a minute. She would call me a spy.
I did. I would call her a spy for the bishop. So Jana, actually, I give her a lot of credit. So one of the things that I did not want to do is meet her. I thought that she was someone who represented the church in every way. And so Jana was like, well, would it be okay if I called you anyway? And I said, yeah, sure. And so Jana would call me Tuesday nights, actually. I remember the specific day. For several months, we didn't meet. And so she would ask me questions, sometimes just, how are you? And anytime something felt uncomfortable for me, I am one of those people that if I feel really, really uncomfortable, I'm just not going to say anything. And so I wouldn't. So there would be these like 5-10-minute kind of moments of silence on the phone. And so I give Jana a lot of credit for that, because I feel like if I kept calling someone and they didn't speak to me and they would just be quiet, I don't know that I would continue to call them. And Jana did, and I think just somewhere along the way over time, I started to realize that maybe she actually was someone who could be safe for me to talk to, because I think I would do everything I could to try and make her feel uncomfortable too. So I would say things that weren't very kind. I would also say things that I think could be very scary at times. And so that's something that we're going to talk about a lot, is the idea of trust and how do you build that, because it's not easy after it's been lost.
Krystal, will you also offer counseling or therapy resources from the annual conference parallel with this?
Not from the annual conference. I did have Jana, who was by my side, and did tell me, hey, it'd be really great if you could be in counseling, because I think that would be very helpful for you. And so initially I had tried a counselor. I didn't necessarily like them. I didn't feel like I had any connection. So I stopped going to counseling. And then I sort of saw my whole life continue to fall apart, because at the same time as I was dealing with this, right, I was also dealing with my mom having just died as well. And Jana would, on a pretty regular basis, tell me, you really should be seeing a counselor. And my first thought consistently, do you remember what I'd ask you? And I'd say, are you trying to get rid of me? And Jana was pretty consistent, like, no, I want you to have multiple people who can support you. And so while I wasn't offered counseling formally through the conference, Jana was consistently telling me that. And then I think somewhere along the way I said, I tried and I didn't really like that person, and I don't feel like I could find anyone who could connect with. And Jana actually found a counselor, sent me the information and the contact, and said, you should contact this person. And I did, and I wound up seeing that counselor, who was really phenomenal. And I still, different context now, I think, but I still continue to see her at times, because I think that it's really helpful.
And did the annual conference offer to pay for this?
Not initially. That's a no. This year, March. Oh, sorry. The question was, did the conference offer to pay for counseling? And the answer is not initially. But the bishop did contact me this year and say that he would like to. And so they did ask for just some like receipts and stuff for the counseling that I had paid for, and then did actually send me some funding for counseling this year. Yes.
I just want to know whether anybody in the room knows whether this might be one of those appropriate uses of insurance money for an annual conference. That may be something to ask our insurance people, but thank you.
Good question.
Question's really for Jana. Were you equipped with knowledge about the complaint process and open discipline so that if there were questions, you could either offer an answer or point her to someone who could answer?
Yes, as part of the training that I had as a support person, the question was, were you equipped with understanding the complaint process? And during the training that I had for serving as a support person, that was part of the training, how to walk through the complaint process. And we definitely would have done that, except that once the clergy person surrendered orders, there was no longer any accountability to the process. Yes?
So who does the training?
In each annual conference, I think it's a little bit different. Back in 2000, my district superintendent asked if I would be willing to serve in this way, and that there was going to be training that was offered, and it was our COSRO, our local annual conference COSRO, that was bringing in a person who was going to offer this training. And there were several of us who participated in the training. And one thing that I would say at this point is that there were people who were self-aware enough to know that this was not a way that they could serve in the church. And so after they started the training, then stepped away, knowing that it was more than what they could handle. Yes?
The level that the conference decided that it was no longer a challenge because of the person surrendering their credentials, did they not feel they had a moral obligation to continue in some way, or was it just enough that we're not in it any longer and they can go?
Well, at that point, that's where we shifted from the formal complaint process. The bishop called me and said, the clergy person has surrendered their orders, and if you would be willing, would you continue in a care relationship with Krystal? And I said I would be willing to walk alongside her as long as she needed that support.
I guess maybe I'm talking about the time factors or something. I mean, just this happened while he was in relationship with the conference, and now all of a sudden he's no longer in relationship with the conference, and so we just say that's it. What about any of the previous time factors?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
He did what he did while he was in covenant connection with the conference.
Right.
Just because he surrendered his credentials, that what he did not go away.
Right.
So somehow, is it easy for us to say, and are the rules such that we're just finished at that point?
At that point, it would need to move into civil criminal court. And that would be at the choice of the complainant.
So what, if any, and how would the process be different had she been a minor at the time of the?
At that point, the bishop would have had to call the authorities.
But your role, would you have still been called if she was a minor, and would you have walked alongside her in the same way as she was a minor?
I would have been called, but it would be significantly different because there would be the church process and there would be the criminal court process as well.
Follow-up question, if I can, would you have had to obtain consent from someone else besides her? Or
Yeah. Yeah.
passed away?
Yeah.
It would have been messy.
Well, when your mom died, you were already
Yeah.
18, right?
So I was already 18, and I think I also waited multiple years. So I reported much, much after, because initially I didn't actually realize that I wasn't the one who did something wrong. And so at that point, I was already far beyond a minor. If I had been a minor at the time and had reported, then yes, you would have gone through the process with whoever the legal guardian was as well.
We just want to say a little bit around broken trust. And as you heard, as Krystal talked about what she thought my role was in terms of being a spy for the bishop, that I would be reporting back to the bishop conversations with her. And that's one thing that both in training and in conversation with the bishop about serving in this role was made very clear. The support role for the victim is very confidential. And so I was not expected to report back to the bishop about conversations that we had had. And if we were part of the complaint process, if that had followed through, there would have been times when I might have needed to report back about a particular step that was happening in the process. But in this particular case, where it was support moving through the healing process, there really was no conversation with the bishop about what had happened. And as a matter of fact, there was a time where the bishop had a conversation with the bishop, and he had said to her, well, if you need me to reconnect you with Jana, I'd be happy to do that. And Krystal said,
I said, what's the point? I text her like every day anyway.
And so one of the things that he has said to me is that he has appreciated so much how I've continued to support Krystal and not interacted with him around that in ways that would break that confidentiality. Yes?
The issue of confidentiality, is that unique to your conference? Because you are told that confidential cannot be confidential that relates to case. For instance, if she had said to you, I lied,
Mm-hmm.
you have to report that. That would not be something that you need to go in saying, I can't keep everything confidential if it relates to the case. I need to keep that confidential.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. If it relates to the case, that's a different story. But in terms of the journey from victim to survivor, that care piece is kept in confidentiality. Mm-hmm.
You said that you had to pursue Krystal to get her to talk to you by phone or whatever. Are there cases that you've worked with that you had to convince the person, or you went to the person and said, now what do you need from me? And they knew, or that what they wanted to see happen? Or was this case that she already knew she was going to pursue it and she just didn't want to talk to you?
Well, I didn't enter into the picture until after the complaint was already filed, and so that decision had been made. And really, I didn't feel like I had to do a whole lot of pursuing. I kind of stayed back and let Krystal set the course, and I think she needed to know that there was somebody who was going to stay in this with her, and that she wasn't going to be left on her own. And so I might give a call and check in, see if there was anything that I could do in terms of being a listening ear or be in conversation. And even though I think she felt like perhaps I was letting her know that, I really tried to hang back and let her set the course. Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's kind of awkward. I'm a little confused. I want to make sure I understand that advocacy is a role about care and not agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're not, the role as an advocate is not to push somebody towards something
Right.
or to, it's to provide support, care, and encouragement for
Right.
those, well, we'll talk about the next session,
Mhm.
the accused, but
Right.
that's the role. Right?
Yes.
We don't have an agenda except for
No, absolutely not. We would absolutely let the victim take the lead when it comes to the care piece of it. If you're in the formal complaint process, then there are going to be more steps that you're going to help the person to walk through. Yes.
Was there any time, and this is, I guess, not I don't want to make it specific about your relationship,
Mm-hmm.
but is there a time that the person that is to be a support, where they would need to be clear about what they can do and what they cannot do? For example, was there ever a time, maybe, Krystal, that you felt like you needed to ask Jana for something, and then she could say, well, that's really not something that I can do, and
Yeah. So the question was, is there ever a time that I needed to ask a question about what Jana could and could not do? And I think the answer to that is yes. There was actually a couple of times where I was unsure about sort of the process, where I had questions where I was like, is this something that you would ask the bishop? Is there something that I would ask the bishop? And I actually think the first couple of times that I had questions for bishops, I think I shot them through you first. And then I think I just started harassing him on my own. There was even a time where, so I told you I'm very into service. I think that that's a part of who I am. I had gone to Haiti in years past with UMVIM, and I wanted to, the group that I had gone with, they were doing another year. But something that you need to have is this paperwork, right, to go, and you need to have the pastor of your church sign it. I was no longer going to church, so I didn't have a pastor to sign it. But the whole cohort that I'd gone with the very first time was going again, and they were like, Krystal, come with us. And I really wanted to go. It was such a life-changing experience for me. And so one of the questions that I asked was, can you sign as my pastor? I know that you're not, and I know this isn't here, but is that okay? Like, is that something that you can do? To which Jana said, I would not be able to do that without asking the bishop first if I was able to do that. And so she went back to the bishop, asked, and then contacted me back and said, the bishop said it would be fine if I signed this paperwork for you. So there were definitely times where there were questions that I had that Jana would be the person that I would go to and say, hey, can you do this for me? I'm not sure. Yeah.
say that, so are there times as the support person that you need to be clear on what your role is and what it is not? And do you have conversation, and when is the right time to have that conversation in this initial?
Is it okay if I say something about Sharice?
Yeah.
So there was a point where another clergy person heard about what had happened, and that clergy person was part of the June project. And so that clergy person had information about the June project, kind of like what we saw this morning, around all of that before the complaint happened information. And I didn't have that information. I had never heard of the June project. It wasn't an official mission of the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference. And I didn't know who was involved. I didn't know what it was about. But this pastor did, and had concerns about what had happened in the June project and what was continuing to happen in terms of hearing some concern and discomfort with teens who were on those trips. And so that person went to the bishop and shared those concerns. And I sensed, and as a matter of fact, that clergy person said, well, why doesn't Jana act as that kind of advocate? And I suspect that Krystal may have wondered why I didn't advocate in that way for her. I had no knowledge of that, and so couldn't speak to what the project was like or the people who participated in that project. So that was a place where I was not going to go. I'm supporting Krystal where she is now and hopefully helping to move toward healing. And that was not a piece of my role. And so I didn't step into that area. Somebody else who was aware and part of that stepped in and shared that information. Yes?
I am still stuck a little bit on the piece of confidentiality, only because I come at it as an elder and a counselor. So like as a counselor, you would be provided with a piece of paper that was very clear about what you could keep confidential and not confidential. And so hearing your dialogue, I just am feeling a little confused. And I'd like for you to maybe tell me, did you make that very clear with Krystal about what you could and could not keep confidential? Was there any kind of paperwork that was provided to her that would outline that?
Go ahead.
Okay, so no, there was not paperwork. I can say that. But Jana did make very clear to me certain things that she could and could not keep confidential. I think that it's really important to make sure that the person that you're supporting knows that confidentiality is real, because that's how you build trust. And so I think I knew from the beginning sort of what she had said would be confidential. I didn't actually believe it, but I knew what she had said would be confidential. And so I think that I never, I don't know, I don't think that it ever really became something that I worried about too much, or I don't know if Jana worried about anything. But I think that it was clear from the beginning sort of that our relationship was going to be kept confidential according to what sort of guidelines she had laid out for me to begin with. And again, like I said, I didn't actually believe it. I knew several years later when I talked to the bishop and he offered to reconnect us. Like then I was like, oh, actually, like she really did keep my confidence really well. But there was sort of we didn't sign paperwork. There wasn't anything like that, but we did sort of have that conversation. Yeah.
I think for me, it's two things. We have not dealt with paperwork, any kind of covenant in our annual conference around that, and that may be something helpful to think about. When I think about that confidentiality piece, I would never talk to a clergy person friend about the support that I was giving to Krystal, and I let her know, I will not share your story with anybody else. There were times when it could have been helpful to me, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow, in terms of self-care. It could have been very helpful to have somebody that I could talk to about what I was feeling, hearing this information and knowing where Krystal was emotionally. But that was the confidentiality. So I wasn't going back and reporting to the bishop. That was not something that was asked of me. And that's more what I'm talking about in terms of keeping the confidentiality. So I wasn't sharing it with clergy colleagues, and I wasn't talking to the bishop, and he never asked me to do that.
So would it only be, so what kind of language did you say about what you had to report? Like, so let's say, she gave the example earlier of, let's say Krystal said, I lied.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of other things would you have said that you would have to say?
That wasn't something, and I will say that was something in our training that really wasn't part of these are the things. And again, this might be something for teams to think about. What are those things that need to be shared when you're working with someone in this relationship? That was not a specific part. I would have known that if she had said that to me, that I lied. Though again, thinking about Sally this morning, I could see that at some point Sally might go back to her support person and say, maybe it was me. Maybe this really was all my fault. And knowing what happened, seeing evidence, that's not the case. But that's the victim second guessing, doubting themselves. And so I would be very careful about going back and saying to the bishop or to whomever, this person is doubting now. Because that can change depending on how they are feeling about themselves. I'm going to ask us to hold questions for a little bit longer. We hope to give you time at the end. But we would really like for you to take a look at some case studies and invite you to process in small groups those case studies. And what I'll do is I'll ask different groups of people to take a different study so that we can get a little response, hopefully on each one of them. There are 5 studies, and so I think what we'll try to do is see if we can't get 5 different groups of people. So let's do on this side, these 2 rows. Now let's do the 3 rows, because there are 3 of you back there, right? So let's do the first 3 rows are going to be a group. And then the last 2 rows, you all be a group. And I think we're going to pull over 3 people from the back and bring them over here. And then these 2 rows be a group. The next 2 rows be a group. And the next 2 rows be a group.
So you first 3 rows will be case study number 1. Following in the back, you'll be case number 2. You guys will be case number 3. Second set here, case number 4, and then in the back, case number 5.
And feel free, I don't know whether we have permission to do this or not, but I will ask to be forgiven later. Go ahead and turn your chairs around so you're in a circle and can have conversation with each other. And we want for you to have somebody in the group read out loud the case study and then discuss that case study and come up with ways that you would address and handle the situation.
What we're going to do is we're just going to read through your scenario real quickly. And then we just want to take a minute or 2 briefly to sort of hear how you said you would respond. So if you could have one person just sort of report out what your group kind of talked about, that'd be great. Okay. So I'm going to start with scenario 1. And I'll read it and then we'll just hear from you for a brief minute or 2 because I want to respect our time as well. What you sort of discussed in how you would respond. All right. So scenario 1 was you've been working with a survivor of sexual abuse for a little over 2 months. The survivor shared their story. Years after the abuse, and a just resolution was not reached. The clergy person turned in their orders. You've spoken about her feelings often, and you've seen her slowly deteriorating. In speaking with you today, she tells you she is considering ending her life. How would you respond to this situation?
We said that first you need to take the information seriously. Could we ask
Yeah, actually, if we could get one person.
It's a lot for Krystal to repeat. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
We said that first you would be sure to take the information seriously, that you would listen carefully, and perhaps you could convince her to voluntarily get help. One of the phrases we came up with was, we have to expand our team to help you so that you could get further help. Reinforce that you will continue to stay with them. Along the way in the relationship, you have noticed deterioration, so you certainly want to take this seriously. It was also brought up that it's absolutely critical that you can quickly put your hands on some resources, who to call, who to get help with if you are not able to handle this by yourself, which none of us thought we would be.
Thank you.
So scenario number 2, you've been working with a survivor for just about a year and a half after substantial long-term sexual abuse. You help the survivor to find a counselor. Between the work that you've done and the support she's receiving from counseling, the survivor is no longer considered in crisis. While she appears to be handling the trauma well and doing significantly better, she continues to question you about her feelings of normalcy. She asks you if you think she'll ever be normal or healthy ever again. How do you respond? Come on up to the microphone.
All right, we had lots of good experts in our group. Robert was reflecting on his, yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay.
We're a little sorry.
We had some good experts in our group, so I'm going to repeat back what they shared. Robert, from his experience, talked about being a keeper of the sacred story. So looking back over the chapters of that person's life, being able to help them listen to that and carry those chapters and keep them and help them think about what maybe the next chapters looked like. And we talked about affirming that was a good question and keep asking lots of questions and follow up to that question. What does normal look like? And then, of course, the power of being with a group of survivors, encouraging them to get with some other folks who are experiencing that new normal, moving on into another chapter of their life. And we all talked about the power of that long-term relationship, that you're in a unique relationship with this person who has shared with you, a powerful part of their life, and that you may not be meeting with them frequently, but over time that you still are there to be able to listen to them and to encourage them to interact with professionals as is appropriate, but that you're still there over the long term.
Thank you so much. Scenario number 3. You've been working with a survivor of sexual harassment for 6 months. The complaint has been resolved through a just resolution. The accused clergy person has returned to their appointment after required counseling and a full apology. While some of your time together has been spent discussing immediate care and needs, lately the conversations have changed. The survivor seems more and more angry with the church and the bishop and has consistently started to criticize your bishop and some of your colleagues to you. How would you respond?
We began the conversation with, your work's not over. Keep listening, keep asking questions, and we acknowledged that, yeah, you might still be very angry and upset and hurt. And so drawing that out of the person. And we asked the question, how was the joint resolution come to? Was the person in agreement with it when it happened, or did she feel or he feel forced into the joint resolution? There may be some anger with that process that took place. And then, and it says, lately the conversations have changed. So We made some assumptions in reading the case study, but has something else happened? The person that's back in preaching, and is it still in the same church? And so has something else gone on in the church? Is this person being revered as the expert or the most powerful person, and everybody loves him or her, and so this person's feeling anger in that capacity? And then we also asked the question, we said we don't know, but survivor of sexual harassment for 6 months, is it a member of the congregation or is it a employee of the church? And how might those dynamics begin to shift the person's feelings if they're reporting to this person as an employee versus a member of the congregation?
Number 4, you've been working with a male survivor of one encounter of sexual abuse by a clergy person for the last 18 months. A just resolution was reached and the clergy person was defrocked. The survivor tells you he feels healthy and no longer needs support, but would sometimes like to keep in touch and check in. How do you respond?
We considered several different things that might apply because to a certain extent this would be on somewhat of a case-by-case basis. But we said that it might be that as time goes on, there's kind of an organic end or lessening of the contact as you just are shifting into a different phase of relationship, and that you would just need to watch your own boundaries in how you proceed as to whether this was continuing to be a healthy relationship or was there some kind of codependency forming. You would need to consider your own life circumstances. What do you have to give to this person over what kind of a period of time? To know your own scope of practice, what you are capable of giving and what this person might need, and knowing when to refer, that there might be a time when you need to refer this person. But also recognizing how important it can be in the life of a survivor to have somebody who knows their story and who has walked with them, so that when there are occasional flare-ups or eruptions, they have somebody to turn to that already knows all of that and can offer support in those moments. In this case, we said in particular, all of the stories about the Roman Catholic Church might trigger this person every single time there's something new coming, and for them to have somebody that they can just turn to and know could be very valuable. So lots of factors to consider depending on the particulars.
Thank you so much for that. Scenario number 5, you've been working with a survivor of sexual abuse for a little over 3 years. There was no just resolution, and while the clergy person quit, they had many supportive clergy that justified his behavior. The survivor tells you while she feels like she has healed a lot, she is not certain about church. She states she really misses being a part of a faith community. However, because of how her abuser's peers supported her abuser, she doesn't know if she'll belong at a church. She asks for your suggestions and advice. How do you respond?
We had a lot of brilliant support in our group. So we got a list. First, while we acknowledge that she has healed a lot, that she's still hurting a lot. And so to help to unpack the fear of attending worship, to kind of help understand where that root is. To search for a church with a female pastorate. The example specifically stated that the perpetrator was male. That is not necessarily in and of itself going to fix anything. And we acknowledged that in our discussion, but we wanted to list it. To seek a counselor outside of the faith community. To suggest the possibility of a denominational exchange, or to seek a church outside the denomination for the interim inflexibility. Because while acknowledging her new normal, we want to continue to encourage her in her spiritual growth. So it was suggested that maybe finding a spiritual director to help her engage in that continued conversation. Lastly, we had a really interesting comment about finding a partner for worship. Similar to shepherding within the safe sanctuaries. And so we thought, well, that would work, kind of. So that was our list.
Great, thank you.
For our group in the back, was there one more group that we're missing sort of a response from? That's everyone? Okay, great. Thank you. So we want to thank you for taking some time. We're running a little short on time, so what we were going to do is talk a little bit about each one of those scenarios. But we're kind of out of time, so we want to say thank you for having your thoughtful conversations. We have time for maybe one question, I think, total. But Jana and I will also stand in the back if you have any other questions.
Before doing questions, though, would you be willing, since that group number 5 addressed going back to church, would you be willing to talk about that?
Yeah. So church was something that I was not certain that I ever wanted to do again, because both of the times that I'd gone, it didn't really turn out well. And so one of the things that I say 2 years ago-ish, I started thinking about faith more and talking to Jana more about wanting to be a part of a faith again, but not really knowing how. And so Jana suggested introducing me to another pastor who could offer some spiritual guidance in a way. And that person's actually in this room right now. And I'm not going to call her out because she's shy. But she's been wonderful too, and we talked a lot about faith. And then after about a year and a half, I started thinking, maybe I've been talking about faith. I've been talking to Jana. Maybe it's time for me to start thinking about being part of a church community again, because I do kind of miss that a little. So one of the fun facts that I always use about myself is that I Google everyone. So if you're a speaker here, I can guarantee you I've Googled you. So lucky. I know everything about you. That's available online. And so I did what I normally do, and that is that I Googled all of the churches that were in my area. I think that being part of a Methodist church is something that has always been impactful for me. So while there was a part of me that was like, I don't ever want to go back to the Methodist faith, when I sort of looked at the theology of other faiths, I said, Methodism's kind of where I belong. So I Googled a bunch of churches. I sent that list to Jana and the other clergy person, and I said, hey, can you rank these for me? You know the clergy, you know the churches. Can you just sort of give me a list of where? And so they did, and said, these are the places where I think you might fit really well. And so I started to visit those churches. And I can say that I have found one that I've been going for probably, I think almost 4 months now. I started visiting churches in May, and I think I sort of settled on this one in like mid-June. And it's something that I think that I can finally say that I think I'm starting to find again. I haven't said that I'm a member, and I continue to say that, that I wouldn't call myself yet a member of that church, but it's a community that I really enjoy, that has a large mission focus. I actually just did my first volunteer kind of thing with them this past week and cooked for the group of people that they had through IHN serving at the church. So I think that I've found that sort of faith community that so far is really, really good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You all join me in thanking the most courageous
Thank you.
at this event and the best that Methodism has to offer. So I just want to thank you both. This was a challenging presentation with a lot of work and a lot of love and a hunk of courage. And we just thank you so much.